So I'm excited to get started with our first presenter, Dr. Usha Tummala-Narra, who's a clinical psychologist and director of community-based education at the Danielson Institute and a research professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Boston University. Her research and scholarship focus on immigration, trauma, race, and culturally informed psychoanalytic psychotherapy. Her publications include over 90 peer-reviewed articles and chapters in books, and she's also in independent clinical practice and works primarily with survivors of trauma from diverse sociocultural backgrounds. She's the author of Psychoanalytic Theory and Cultural Competence in Psychotherapy and the editor of Trauma and Racial Minority Immigrants, both published with the American Psychological Association. And the title of her presentation is Addressing Racial Injustice and Trauma Through Research, Practice, and Community Engagement. Thank you, Dr. Tummala-Narra.
Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today, and thank you, Steve, for your introduction. Today, I am going to be talking about racial injustice and trauma and trying to weave through my roles as a researcher, as a practitioner, and also now in a new initiative at the Danielson Institute, trying to translate what we know in research and practice, particularly clinical theory and practice, into community education and engagement. So I'm going to just begin with providing a little bit of context for this work and then specifically focus on my work and particularly my research and my community education work with Indian American, South Asian American communities as a way to kind of translate and integrate research practice and community education today. So just to provide some context, if we think about, I think many of us know the importance of culturally informed practices in clinical work and also in research. But just to draw some background to my work, one of the things that I focus on is examining our conceptualizations that actually guide theory, practice, and research. And most often, we see that our conceptualizations are embedded in Euro-American conceptualizations. And there tends to be less attention placed on individual and collective resilience from a culturally informed perspective. So, for example, we tend to think of resilience as something that's a trait that we carry with us, that either we're born with or that we learned and acquired somewhere along the way, versus broadening that idea into a collective perspective that, in fact, we have resilience in communities, and different communities define resilience in different ways, in unique ways. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. We also see that the research and the findings, that the really important findings that we have that help us understand different communities and the traumas that they're struggling with, the mental health concerns that they have, and how they heal from those and how they approach those concerns. That research is not very readily accessible to the public. And so we tend to keep our research in our journals, in our academic journals. We have them in our clinical discussions, but far less in terms of community interaction and public interaction around those findings. The other thing that I would say, you see on the slide, is that in addition to the research not being very accessible, our culturally informed practices in psychotherapy, those are not necessarily very accessible either to communities across the United States, and I would say globally as well. So given all of this, one of my interests, my growing interest, is in this area of what can we do to make information more accessible to our communities. So in my own work, in my own theorizing about culturally informed psychotherapy, there are a few areas that I have been focusing on over the past many years. And these are a few things on the slide that describe some core areas of culturally informed psychoanalytic psychotherapy, since that's my primary orientation. And you'll see here that there's attention to affect and expression, language, bilingualism, multilingualism, and the focus on indigenous narrative, and I just want to focus a couple of points on the slide. The indigenous narrative idea refers to a cultural narrative that holds significance to a person and to a community, that we actually learn cultural narratives and understandings of mental health that are different perhaps from our own, or similar in certain ways but distinct at the same time. And oftentimes this narrative is something that is difficult to tap into in psychotherapy, that we're approaching our work from our own particular lens. And in research as well, we have certain methodologies that we use that may not tap into some of the nuances of unique cultural narratives as well. The fourth point that you see here on the slide is the effects of social oppression. And I'm going to focus on this. This is bolded because I'm going to talk about this in relation to South Asian Americans and Hindu Indian Americans as well. The effects of social oppression cannot be overstated. We now have very clear empirical data indicating the direct associations between the impacts of racism, sexism, homophobia, heterosexism, transphobia, ableism, misogyny, other forms of oppression on mental health, including things like depression and anxiety, eating disorders, substance abuse, suicidality, and so on. So I want to just focus on that. I won't go over the rest of this slide for now, but let me move into describing this role of social oppression in the experience of South Asian Americans. Just to situate myself, I'm an Indian American person. I immigrated from India when I was 7 years old, so I would be considered a 1.5 generation. So the first generation being those individuals who arrive as adults to a new country, the second generation being those who are children of those first generation being born and raised in the US. So if you look at these figures here, 1 in 5 South Asians, these are estimates, and we don't have great prevalence data, by the way, in this community or these sets of communities. 1 in 5 South Asians have reported experiencing a mental health disorder sometime in their lifetime. Mental health problems tend to be more prevalent among women versus men, but that's with a caveat that women tend to also report more distress outwardly to people outside of their communities compared with men. South Asian American youth are at a high risk for suicidal thoughts and behaviors. I'm pointing these figures out to you all because the invisibility of these issues, both outside of South Asian communities and within South Asian communities, something to be highlighted, actually, because there's not a great deal of awareness within our own communities about the prevalence of mental health distress. So these are some of the things we know from our research literature in terms of what are some of the sources of distress within our communities. Stress that's related to acculturating to a new country, which is a lifelong process. It doesn't end at the time that one learns English or becomes fluent in the English language, or becomes familiar with customs and traditions, or has an exciting job or an educational opportunity. Acculturation continues throughout one's lifetime. But stress related to acculturation and isolation is a key source of stress. There's also stress related to trauma, both pre-migration trauma as well as post-migration trauma. So oftentimes immigrants, we carry events that have happened in our home countries into the new country. In my family's case, the reason we moved to the United States, one of the main, the impetus was intercaste kind of violence. There's violence in the area, the region of Hyderabad, where my family and I lived. And because of that political violence around us, it made it increasingly difficult to remain there, and this opportunity came up to move to the United States. And of course, other traumatic experiences like domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and so on. Another source of threat of stress is minority stress, and the notion of model minority, which I'm sure that many of you are familiar with, but this idea that somehow Asian Americans, including South Asian Americans, because of this perception of academic or financial or professional success within various Asian American communities, even though Asian American communities are highly diverse, there's no singular monolithic experience of being an Asian American. And, but this notion of success sort of gives off this perception that somehow we don't have any problems in our communities, that we should be doing okay, we don't have stress that we're dealing with, or that we deal with racism. It also, that notion also pits various racial minority groups against each other and divides people in terms of some minority groups being seen as the model and others not the model, right? So this kind of pressure, why is this a source of pressure for so many South Asian Americans? Because this idea, this notion or stereotype becomes internalized. And for those of us in our communities that if we're struggling with academics or we're struggling with reaching certain goals or professional goals, that actually becomes a source of distress. Like, I've heard so many times from kids, from adults, I should be good at math, I'm Asian. This idea, and I grew up not liking math at all, and not being great at math either. So, there's these ways in which we internalize these different ideas that are in the dominant communities, but also internalized within communities that are actually problematic and can cause stress. Another source of stress has to do with intergenerational family conflict. And here's where we have differences within families from older and younger members of a family that are different than sort of generational gaps that tend to be fairly universal. So acculturation gaps refer to worldview differences, cultural worldview differences among family members, where older members might be more oriented to heritage culture and younger members might be oriented towards a more mainstream American kind of context. And indeed, these cultural worldview differences exist, but one of the sources of stress that is not being processed in understanding these acculturation gaps is racism and discrimination that's being experienced by different members of a family. And those experiences tend not to get processed and talked about openly within the family context. So there's this belief that somehow we just have these cultural differences, and that's the source of distress within a family. But in fact, that could be part of it, but in addition to that, each member of a family is also struggling with discrimination that's not being spoken about. And most often, kids are not wanting to burden their parents or caregivers with their stress at school, their stress in neighborhoods, social media, whatever the case might be, because they do believe that the family or the parents are actually dealing with more stress, or they might feel that the parents couldn't possibly understand what it's like for them to grow up in the United States. The next point I want to make here, well, the last point you see are legal, financial concerns, immigration status concerns, visa concerns as well. That could be sources of stress. But the last point I want to make here on this slide has to do with the immigrant paradox, which refers to a phenomenon that's been observed in the majority of studies conducted comparing first generation and second generation racial minority immigrants in terms of mental health outcomes and educational outcomes. And what we find is that the second generation tends to actually do worse on mental health outcomes and educational outcomes compared with the first generation. And we call this a paradox because it's counterintuitive, because immigrants come to the United States imagining that the next generation will actually do better in terms of health outcomes, in terms of education, professional outcomes, and so on. So one of the speculations around why this phenomenon exists is the role of racism and discrimination. When children grow up from preschool and beyond, sometimes earlier, and they're exposed to stereotypes and discrimination at a very early age, and that gets perpetuated and continues throughout the course of their development. It's a very different kind of developing a sense of self compared to their parents, who would have developed a sense of self and identity in a country outside of the United States. Perhaps they carry other kinds of pre-migration biases, forms of discrimination and prejudice with them, but not in the same type of racism that exists in the United States. So that's a distinction as well. So keeping all of these issues in mind, I want to move now to thinking about what actually keeps us from finding the help we need. We know that there's an underutilization of mental health services among Asian Americans broadly, but certainly South Asian Americans as well. There is stigma and shame often connected with mental health issues and concerns. Speaking outside of one's family about what's private and personal is difficult. There's also challenges in identifying distress. So sometimes we reach crisis levels before we actually think something is worth seeking help for. So there's this idea that I must be crazy if I'm seeing a therapist or a counselor. And so a great deal of stigma around that. And then there's, I would say, also silence about problems like trauma. Growing up in the United States in my Indian American community, I can speak to how difficult it was to speak about somebody being physically abused, somebody who had an experience of sexual abuse in their families or with another community member. And the idea of speaking out loud about those issues was profoundly terrifying. And there was also this fear that if you disclose something like that, it was the reputation of your family or your community that would suffer because of that. I've already talked about the model minority notion. The other barrier that I want to highlight is the lack of culturally informed providers and resources. So I can't tell you how many people in my community would say, who's going to understand me? How can they possibly understand what an arranged marriage is, and and my parents had an arranged marriage, or that I had an arranged marriage, or what our in-law relationships are like, what our family relationships are like. Because if we go back to that idea of our theories and conceptualizations being embedded in Euro-American conceptualizations, right, or ideas or notions of health and pathology, then of course the public is aware of this. We know that we have to sort of perform a certain way when we're not in our own context, that we have a dual sense of self that operates when we're engaging within our families and communities and when we leave our communities. So this becomes a challenge as well. So there's often a fear of not just the person feeling the fear of being pathologized themselves, but also families, their families, the people they love also being pathologized in some way. So I'll just say very quickly a couple things about racism against South Asians in the US, and I want to share a couple of findings from a few research projects that I've conducted, my colleagues have conducted, but just to give you a background on racism against South Asians in the US, we have a long history of racism, so I'm not going to get into the pre-1965 racism. The first South Asians arrived in the 1800s in the United States, largely in a farming community in the West Coast, and most people are not aware of that history. Most people think South Asians arrived in post-1965 after the Immigration and Naturalization Act. But in the time that I was growing up in the US, in the East Coast, I was in New York and New Jersey, and in the 1980s, this was a time in New Jersey and northern Pennsylvania of a time called the Dot Buster, an era of the Dot Busters, which lasted about 15 years or so. And this was an era where there was an influx of South Asian immigrants to the United States and to that particular region. There was a white street gang called the Dot Busters who used to terrorize, vandalize, harass, murder South Asian immigrants during this time. This received very little media attention, very little local news, national news, and in fact, most South Asians who come after, who have come to the U.S. Much later, are not aware of this history either, because it's just not been publicized. And so this was known as the Dot Busters, this group, because of the bindi, or the dot, people refer to as a dot, but it's a bindi that many Hindu Indian women wear, and so on their foreheads. So this became, this is just one form of racism. And then post 9/11, this is another significant time when many South Asian Americans were targeted. Those perceived to be Muslim or Arab or having Arab descent were terrorized. And we know that the first murder post 9/11 and that backlash against people who seemingly were Muslim was of a Sikh man. And then moving forward into more contemporary times, since 2015, there have been 484 documented incidents of hate crimes against South Asians, Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, Middle Eastern, and Arab Americans. You'll see just an example of this, a 57-year-old Indian man, partially paralyzed in Alabama, when a police officer forced him on the ground after receiving a report of a suspicious person. So people calling, people suspicious. This person was just walking around the neighborhood. And then you look at post-2016 elections between November 2015 to November 2017. We have 302 incidents, a 45% increase in the administration's invoked hate crimes. We have protests. We have collective resistance to this as well. Protests of hate crimes beyond post 9/11. And this is in Kansas City in a march in 2017, where there was a murder of a young Indian American man in a bar, and a shooting of his friend as well. This person, who came in with a gun and shot them and told them to go back to their country. So this is a very contemporary problem, and it's more rampant, and I will say receives very little coverage in the news and very little coverage in the mental health professions in terms of understanding the impact of that on everyday experiences of South Asian Americans. In terms of the research on race and racism within our communities, some of my studies, those of my colleagues indicate very clearly that experiences of discrimination predict depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, other mental health symptomology among South Asians. We also have research that indicates that there's this thing that we do within our communities to manage the model minority stereotype, as well as how we manage discrimination more broadly. And we call this, Shantanu Kanukolu and Ram Mahalingam at University of Michigan have called this positive impression management as model minorities, that it makes so that outside of my community, I want to make sure how I present myself, because if I don't present myself as all together, and that somehow I might actually continue to be targeted for more discrimination. So here we have this problem, this tension between wanting to speak about what's happening within our communities, like trauma that occurs within our communities, the racial stress that we might feel within our communities, colorism that we might experience within our communities, but then the fear that if we express that and write about it and talk about it, that in fact we might be stereotyped even further, like, look at this community, they are pathological, they have these problems. And so this is what they're talking about in terms of positive impression management. And yet we see the last point here on the slide, where discrimination is in fact an important risk factor for mental health distress. This doesn't change the reality, and particularly for young people. Remember that second generation and the immigrant paradox, that we find that for second and later generations, this becomes even more profound. In terms of racism, for contextualizing what racism and race actually mean for Indian Americans, my colleague Arpana Inman and also my colleague Anju Kaduvaturk Davidson, the three of us have been working on a couple of studies over the years conducting focus groups with Indian Americans, first with first generation immigrants, and then 1.5 and second generation Indian Americans. And we've been asking them about their experiences of race and racism. How do you conceptualize race? How do you conceptualize racism? What do you do as a way to cope with racism? So we've been trying to more systematically study this area. And what we find over and over again is that there's this influence in the pre-migration context that carries over into the post-migration context for the first generation in particular. Because our communities are actually descendants of colonized people. And we have to remember that South Asian history, we have been colonized by the British. So this is a legacy that we continue to carry with us. So there's an influence of colonization, the caste system, which actually became even more problematic and dangerous in the context of British colonization in India and South Asia. And this model minority stereotype, all of these different contexts are actually in the mix in terms of how Indian Americans and South Asian Americans more broadly tend to conceptualize race. So before 9/11, many South Asian Americans didn't consider themselves people of color. They wouldn't have categorized themselves that way. And then there was this kind of disillusion based on racial hate and crimes and harassment that, in fact, all of a sudden they started to experience themselves as minorities, as people of color. And so, and along with that, when we look at our socializations, very few conversations happen around race and racism within our communities and within our religious organizations and places of worship as well. We also see distinct experiences between the first generation, the immigrant experience, as well as the 1.5 and second generations, where the second generation and 1.5 folks want to talk about this issue more. They've also grown up not really talking about this within their families or communities. And in the immigrant generation, there's almost this feeling like racism is a necessary sacrifice to survive in this new country. And whereas the second generation does not have another home as a point of reference, this is their home. So the experience of racism itself can be very different. I'm going to actually skip over this just for time's sake, because I want to just share with you an illustration of, I want to go back to this idea of community education and conversation. One of the things that I've been recently doing is meeting with people in a local, and we're in the Boston area, so a local Hindu religious center. I'm a Hindu, and I actually took my children, who are now young adults, to this particular religious center when they were growing up. And more recently, I've had these calls to go to the center and talk to them about mental health, and because the mental health distress for the kids actually has been on the rise, and certainly even more so on the rise in the course of the pandemic. So the kids have been asking for people to come in and talk, and now the parents are also incredibly stressed out by this. So recently I've been going in and having conversations within this Hindu religious center, which is called the Chinmaya Mission. And very interestingly, before I actually did the series of conversations there was a lot of anxiety about, what am I going to talk about? What is she going to talk about? And is it going to rock the boat in some way? And is she going to talk about things like trauma? So I had sent my slides in advance to the person organizing this. And she said, do you really have to talk about trauma? That's like a really loaded word. And you might want to tone it down. We don't want to upset anyone. So already the process of trying to do this work, right, trying to disseminate information, trying to engage discussion and conversation is reflective of everything I just spoke about, right, in terms of how difficult it is to have these conversations and the real risk that people feel in talking about very painful experiences that occur within the community. And also, what they're experiencing outside the community in terms of racism. So, because when I sent the slide about trauma, I included racial trauma, and that was also a point where people really were worried about. Nonetheless, in the course of the conversation, when it was actually opened up, it was incredible to me to see how many second generation and first generation individuals in this conversation felt freed up finally to actually talk about it. And it was incredibly liberating. And it was connected to this very fundamental philosophy within Hinduism, which I pass on to my kids all the time, because one of the things I learned as an adult in this particular religious center was that happiness is my birthright, that in fact I was born to be happy. And so it was very powerful to connect this fundamental philosophy that we shared in this community with this idea of how can we actually be happy? How can we actually find that happiness? And what process does it take to get there? And for us, it was about speaking truth, speaking honestly with each other to actually access that happiness and to feel that we deserve that we not only have to make these sacrifices and suffer, but we actually need to have these painful conversations in order to achieve that state of happiness that this community that we all shared. So I'm going to leave us with that. I know that I'm running out of time here, and these slides will be available to everyone. And so I will move it back to Steve. Thank you for listening.